Chapter 1. In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd by ANA MENÉNDEZ. Grove Press. Published by the New York Times on the web. The park where the four men gathered was small before the city put it on its tourist maps. It was just a fenced rectangle of space that people miss on the way to their office jobs. The men came each morning to sit under the shifting shade of a banyan tree, and sometimes the way the wind moved through the leaves reminded them of home. One man carried a box of plastic dominoes. His name was Maximo, and because he was a small man, his grandiose name had inspired him much amusement all his life. He liked to say that over the years he would learn a thing or two about the physics of laughter, and his friends took that to the mean good humor could make a big man out of anyone. Now, Maximo waited for the others to sit before turning the dominoes out on the table. Judging the men to be in good spirits, he cleared his throat and began to tell the joke he had prepared for the day. So Bill Clinton dies in office and they freeze his body. Antonio leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh. Here we go. Maximo caught a roll of the eyes and almost grew annoyed, but he smiled. It gets better. He scraped the dominoes in two wide circles across the table, then continued. Okay, so they freeze his body, and when we get to the technology to unfreeze him, he wakes up in the year 2105. 2105, huh? Very good, Maximo said. Anyway, he's curious about what's happened to the world all this time. So he goes up to a Jewish fellow and he says, So, how are things in the Middle East? The guy replies, Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Everything is like heaven. Everybody gets along now. This makes Clinton smile, right? The men stopped shuffling and dragged their pieces across the table and waited for Maximo to finish. Next, he goes up to an Irishman and he says, So, how are things over there in Northern Ireland now? The guy says, Northern? It's one Ireland now, and we all live in peace. Clinton is extremely pleased at this point, right? So he does that biting thing with his lip. Maximo stopped to demonstrate, and Raul and Carlos slapped their hands on the domino table and laughed. Maximo paused. Even Antonio had to smile. Maximo loved this moment when the men were warming to the joke, and he still kept the punchline close to himself like a secret. So, okay, Maximo continued. Clinton goes to a Cuban fellow and says, Compadre, how are things in Cuba these days? The guy looks at Clinton and he says to the president, Let me tell you, my friend, I can feel it in my bones. Any day now, Castro's gonna fall. Maximo tucked his head into his neck and smiled. Carlos slapped him on the back and laughed. That's a good one. Sure is, he said. I like that one. Funny, Antonio said, nodding as he set up his pieces. Yeah, funny, Raul said. After chuckling for another moment, he added, But old. What do you mean old? Antonio said. Then he turned to Carlos. What are you looking at? Carlos stopped laughing. It's not old, Maximo said. I just made it up. I'm telling you, Professor, it's an old one, Raul said. I heard it when Reagan was president. Maximo looked at Raul but didn't say anything. He pulled a double nine from his row and laid it in the middle of the table. But the thought he intended was lost in the horns and courses of morning traffic on 8th Street. Raul and Maximo had lived on the same El Vedado Street in Havana for 15 years before the revolution. Raul had been a government accountant and Maximo a professor at the university, 2 blocks from his home on L Street. They weren't close friends, but friendly still in that way of people who come from the same place and think they already know the important things about one another. Maximo was one of the first to leave L Street, boarding a plane for Miami on the eve of the 1st of January 1961, exactly 2 years after Batista had done the same. For reasons he told himself he could no longer remember, he said goodbye to no one. He was 36-year-old then, already balding, with a wife and two young daughters whose names he intended to confuse. He left behind the row house of long shiny windows, the piano, the mahogany furniture, and the pension he thought he'd return to in 2 years' time. Three, if things were as serious as they said. In Miami, Maximo tried driving a taxi, but the streets were a web of foreign names and winding curves that could one day lead to glitter and another to the hollow end of a pistol. His Spanish and his University of Havana credentials meant nothing here, and he was too old to cut sugarcane with the younger men who began arriving in the spring of 1961. But the men gave Maxim an idea, and after teary nights of promises, he convinced his wife, she of stately homes and multiple cooks, to make lunch to sell to those sugar men who waited, squatting on their heels in the dark, for the bus to Belgrade every morning. They worked side by side, Maximo and Rosa, and at the end of every day, their hands stained orange from the lard and the cheap meat, their knuckles red and tender where the hot water and the knife blade had worked their business. Maximo and Rosa would sit down to whatever remained of the day's cooking, and they would chew slowly, the day unraveling, their hunger ebbing away with the light. They worked together for years like that, and when the Cubans began disappearing from the bus line, Maximo and Rosa moved their lunch packets indoors and opened their little restaurant right on 8th Street. There, a generation of former professors served black beans and rice to the nostalgic. When Raul showed up in Miami one summer looking for work, Maximo added one more waiter spot for his old acquaintance from L Street. Each night, after the customers had gone, Maximo and Rosa and Raul and Havana's old lawyers and bankers and dreamers will sit around the biggest table and eat and talk, and sometimes, late in the night after several glasses of wine, someone will start the stories that began with, "In Cuba, I remember." They were stories of old lovers, beautiful and round hipped, of skies that stretched unclear and blue to the Cuban hills, of green landscapes that clung to the red clay of Guinness, roots dug in like fingernails in a goodbye. In Cuba, the stories always began. Life was good and pure, but something always happened to them in the end. Something withering, malignant. Maximo never understood it. The stories that opened in sun always narrowed into a dark place, and after those nights, his head throbbing, Maximo will turn and turn in his sleep and awake unable to remember his dreams. Even now, 5 years after selling the place, Maximo couldn't walk by it in the early morning when it was still clean and empty. He would try it once. He would stood and stared into the restaurant and had become lost and dizzy in his own reflection in the glass. The neat row of chairs, the tombstone lunch board behind them. Okay, a bunch of rafters are on the beach getting ready to sail off to Miami. Where are they? Who cares? Wherever. Cuba's got 1,000 miles of coastline. Use your imagination. Let the professor tell this thing, for God's sake. Thank you. Maximo cleared his throat and shuffled the dominoes. So anyway, a bunch of rafters are gathered there on the sand, and they are all crying and hugging their wives, and all the rafts are bobbing on the water, and suddenly someone in the group yells, "Hey, look who goes there!" And it's Fidel in swimming trunks, carrying a raft on his back. Carlos interrupted to let out a yelping laugh. "I like that. I like it. Sure do." "You like it, huh?" said Antonio. "Why don't you let the Cuban finish it?" Maximo slid the pieces to himself in twos and continued. So one of the guys on the sand says to Fidel, "Compatriota, what are you doing here? What's with the raft?" And Fidel sits on his raft and pushes off the shore and says, "I'm sick of this place too. I'm going to Miami." So the other guys look at each other and say, "Coño, compadre, if you're living there, then there's no reason for us to go. Here, take my raft too, and get the fuck out of here." Raoul let a shaking laugh rise from his belly and saluted Maximo with a domino piece. A good one, my friend. Carlos laughed long and loud. Antonio laughed too, but he was careful not to laugh too hard and he gave his friend a sharp look over the racket he was causing. He and Carlos were Dominican, not Cuban, and they ate their same food and played their same games. But Antonio knew they still didn't understand all the layers of hurt in the Cuban jokes. It had been Raul's idea to go down to Domino Park for that first time. Maximo protested. He had seen the rows of tourists pressed up against the fence, gawking at the colorful old guys playing dominoes. I'm not going to be the sad spectacle in someone's vacation slideshow, he'd said. But Raoul was already dressed up in a pale blue guayabera, saying how it was a beautiful day and smelled the air. Let them take pictures, Raoul said. What the hell? Make us immortal. Immortal? Maximo said like a sneer, and then to himself, the god's punishment. It was that year after Rosa died, and Maximo didn't want to tell how he would begin to see her at the kitchen table as she would have been at 25. Watched one thick strand of her dark hair stuck to her morning face. He saw her at 30, bending down to wipe the chocolate off the cheeks of their two small daughters, and his eyes moved from Rosa to his small daughters. He had something he needed to tell them. He saw them grown up at the funeral, crying together. He watched Rosa rise and do the sign of the cross. He knew he was caught inside a nightmare, but he couldn't stop. He would emerge slowly, creaking out of the shower, and there she would be, Rosa, like before, her breasts round and pink from the hot water, calling back through the years. Some mornings he would awake and smell peanuts roasting and hear the faint call of the manicero pleading for someone to relieve his burden of white paper cones. Or it would be thundering, the long, hard thunder of Miami that was so much like the thunder of home that each rumble shattered the morning of his other life. He would awake, caught fast in the damp sheets, and feel himself falling backwards. He took the number 8 bus to 8th Street and 15th Avenue, at Domino Park. He sat with Raoul, and they played alone that first day. Maximo, noticing his own speckled hands, the spots of light through the banyan leaves, a round red beetle that crawled slowly across the table, then hopped next breeze and floated away. Antonio and Carlos were not Cuban, but they knew when to dump their heavy pieces and when to hold back the eights for the final shocking stroke. Waiting for a table, Raul and Maximo would linger beside them and watch them lay their traps, a succession of threes that broke their opponents, an incredible run of fives, even the unthinkable, passing when they had the piece to play. Other twosomes began to refuse to play with Dominicans, said that Tipo Carlos gave them the creeps with his giggling and monosyllables. Besides, any team that won so often must be cheating when they charge, especially a team of one half imbecile. But really, it was that no one plays to lose. You begin to lose again and again, and it reminds you of other things in your life. The despair of it all begins to bleed through, and that is not what games are for. Who wants to live their whole life alongside the lucky? But Maximo and Raoul, like these blessed Dominicans, appreciated the well oiled moves of two old pros. And if the two Dominicans, afraid to be alone again, let them win now and then, who would know? Who could ever admit to such a thing? For many months, they didn't know much about each other. These four men, even the smallest boy, knew not to talk when the pieces were in play. But soon came Maximus' jokes during the shuffling, something new and bright coming into his eyes like daydreams as he spoke. Carlos, full loud laughter, like that of children, and the four men learned to linger long enough between sets to color an old memory while the white pieces scraped along the table. One day, as they sat at their table closest to the sidewalk, a pretty girl walked by. She swung her long brown hair around and looked in at the man with her green eyes. "What the hell is she looking at?" said Antonio, who always sat with his back to the wall, looking out at the street. But the others saw how he returned the stare too. Carlos let out a giggle and immediately put a hand to his mouth. In Santo Domingo, a man once looked at, but Carlos didn't get to finish. "Shut up, you old idiot," said Antonio, putting his hands on the table like he was about to get up and leave. "Please," Maximo said. The girl stared another moment, then turned and left. Raúl rose slowly, flattening down his old hair with his right hand. "Ay, mi niña." "Sit down, hombre," Antonio said. "You're an old fool just like this one." "You're the fool," Raúl called back. "A woman like that." He watched the girl cross the street. When she was out of sight, he grabbed the back of the chair behind him and eased his body down, his eyes still on the street. The other three men looked at one another. "I knew a woman like that once," Raúl said after a long moment. "That's right, he did," Antonio said. "In his moist boy dreams. What was it, a century ago?" "No me jodas," Raúl said. "You're a vulgar man. I had a life all three of you would have paid millions for. Women, women." Maximo watched him, then lowered his face, shuffled the dominoes. "I had a woman," Raúl said. "We all had women," Carlos said, and he looked like he was about to laugh again, but instead just sat there, smiling like he was remembering one of Maximo's jokes. "There was one I remember, more beautiful than the rising moon," Raúl said. "Oh, Jesus," Antonio said. "You people." Maximo looked up, watching Raúl. "Aye, a woman like that," Raúl said and shook his head. "The women of Cuba were radiant, magnificent. Wouldn't you say, Professor?" Maximo looked away. "I don't know," Antonio said. "I think that Americana there looked better than anything you remember." And that brought a long laugh from Carlos. Maximo sat all night at the pine table in his new efficiency, thinking about the green-eyed girl and wondering why he was thinking about her. The table and a narrow bed had come with the apartment, which he moved into after selling their house in Shenandoah. The table had come with two chairs, sturdy and polished, not in the least institutional, but he had moved the other chair by the bed. The landlady, a woman in her 40s, had helped Maximo hold up three potted palms. Later, he bought a green pot of marigolds he saw in the supermarket and brought its butter leaves back to life under the window's eastern light. Maximo often sat at the table through the night, sometimes reading Marti, sometimes listening to the rain on the tin hole of the air conditioner. "When you are older," he would read somewhere, "you don't need as much sleep." And wasn't that funny because his days felt more like sleep than ever. Dinner kept him occupied for hours, remembering the story of each dish. Sometimes, at the table, he greeted old friends and awakened with a start when they reached out to touch him. When dawn rose and slunk into the room sideways through the blinds, Maximo walked as in a dream across the thin patterns of light on the terrazzo. The chair? Why did he keep the other chair? Even the marigolds reminded him. An image returned again and again. Was it the green-eyed girl? And then he remembered that Rosa wore carnations in her hair and hated her name, and that it saddened him because he liked to roll it off his tongue like a slow train to the country. "Rosa," he said, taking her hand the night they met at La Concha while an old danzón played. "Clavel," she said, tossing her head back in a crackling laugh. "Call me Clavel." She pulled her hand away and laughed again. "Don't you notice the flower in a girl's hair?" He led her around the dance floor, lined with chaperones, and when they turned, he whispered that he wanted to follow her, laughter to the moon. She laughed again, the notes round and heavy as summer raindrops, and Maximo felt his fingers go cold where they touched hers. The danzon played, and they turned and turned, and the faces of the chaperones and the moist, warm air. And Maximo, with his cold fingers, worried that she had laughed at him. He was 24 and could not imagine a more sorrowful thing in all the world. Sometimes, years later, he would catch a premonition of Rosa in the face of his eldest daughter. She will turn toward a window or do something with her eyes, and then she will smile and tilt her head back, and her laughter connected him again to that night, made him believe for a moment that life was a string you could gather up in your hands all at once. He sat at the table and tried to remember the last time he saw Marisa, in California now, an important lawyer. A year? Two? Annabelle? Gone to New York? 2 years? They called more often than most children. Maximo knew. They called often, and he was lucky that way. Fidel decides he needs to get in touch with young people. Ay, ay, ay. So his handlers arrange for him to go to school in Havana. He gets all dressed up in his olive uniform, puts conditioner on his beard and brushes it 100 times. All that. Raoul breathed out, letting each breath come out like a puff of laughter. Where do you get these things? No interrupting the artist anymore, okay? Maximo continued. So, after he's beautiful enough, he goes to the school. He sits in on a few classes, walks around the halls. Finally, it's time for Fidel to leave, and he realizes that he hasn't talked to anyone. He rushes over to the assembly that is seeing him off with shouts of Comandante, and he pulls a little boy out of a row. Tell me, Fidel says, what is your name? Pepito, the little boy answers. Pepito, what a nice name, Fidel says. And tell me, Pepito, what do you think of the revolution? Comandante, Pepito says. The revolution is the reason we are all here. Ah, very good, Pepito. And tell me, what is your favorite subject? Pepito answers. Comandante, my favorite subject is mathematics. Fidel pats the little boy on the head. And tell me, Pepito, what would you like to be with when you grow up? Pepito smiles and says, Comandante, I would like to be a tourist. Maximo looked around the table, a shadow of a smile on his thin white lips as he waited for laughter. Ay, Raoul said. That is so funny it breaks my heart. Maximo grew to like dominoes. The way each piece became part of the next after the last piece was laid down, and they were all tallying up the score. Maximo liked to look over the table as an artist might. He liked the way the row of black dots snaked around the table with such free-flowing abandon, it was almost as if, thrilled to be let out of the box, the pieces choreographed a fresh dance of gratitude every night. He liked the straightforward contrast of black on white, the clean, fresh scrape of the pieces across the table before each new round, the audacity of the double nines, the plain, smooth face of the blank, like a newborn unhatched by the world to come. Professor, Raoul began, let's speed up the shuffling a bit, see? I was thinking, Massimo said. Well, that shouldn't take long, Antonio said. Who invented the dominoes anyway? Maximo said. I'd say it was probably the Chinese, Antonio said. No jodas, Raoul said. Who else could have invented this game of skill and intelligence but a Cuban? Coño, said Antonio without a smile. Here we go again. Ah, bueno, Raoul said with a smile stuck between joking and condescending. You don't have to believe it if it hurts. Carlos let out a long laugh. You people are unbelievable, said Antonio, but there was something hard and tired behind the way he smiled. It was the first day of December, but summer still hung about in the brightest patches of sunlight. The four men had sat under the shade of the banyan tree. It wasn't cold, not even in the shade, but three of the men wore cardigans. If asked, They will say they were expecting a chilly north wind, and doesn't anybody listen to the weather forecast anymore? Only Antonio, his round body enough to keep him warm, clung to the short sleeves of summer. Kids from the local Catholic high school had volunteered to decorate the park for Christmas, and they dashed about with tinsel in their hair, bumping one another and laughing loudly. Lucinda, the woman who issued the dominoes and kept back the gambling, asked them to quiet down, pointing at the man. A wind stirred the top branches of the banyan tree and moved on without touching the ground. One leaf fell to the table. Antonio waited for Maximo to fetch Lucinda's box of plastic pieces. Antonio held his brown paper bag to his chest and looked at the Cubans. His customary sourness replaced for a moment by what in a man like him could pass for levity. Maximo sat down and began to dump the plastic pieces on the table as he always did. But this time Antonio held out his hand. "One moment," he said and shook his brown paper bag. "¿Qué pasa, chico?" Maximo said. Antonio reached into the paper bag as the men watched. He let the paper fall away. In his hand, he held an oblong black leather box. "Coño," Raúl said. Antonio set the box on the table like a magician drawing out his trick. He looked around to the men and finally opened the box with a flourish to reveal a neat row of big, heavy pieces, gone yellow and smooth like old teeth. They bent in closer to look. Antonio tilted the box gently, and the pieces fell out in one long line, their black dots facing up now like tight, dark pupils in the sunlight. "Ivory," Antonio said, "and ebony. It's an antique. You are not allowed to make them any more." "Beautiful," Carlos said and clasped his hands. "My daughter found them for me in New Orleans." Antonio continued, ignoring Carlos. He looked around the table and lingered on Maximo, who had lowered the box of plastic dominoes to the ground. "She said she's been searching for them for 2 years. Couldn't wait 2 more weeks to give them to me," he said. "Coño," Raúl said. A moment passed. "Well," Antonio said, "what do you think, Maximo?" Maximo looked at him. Then he bent across the table to touch one of the pieces. He gave a jerk with his head and listened for the traffic. "Very nice," he said. "Very nice," Antonio said. "Very nice?" He laughed in his thin way. "My daughter walked all over New Orleans to find this, and the Cuban think it's very nice." He paused, watching Maximo. "Did you know my daughter is coming to visit me for Christmas, Maximo? You can tell her that the gift was very nice, but not as nice as some of you remember, huh?" Maximo looked up, his eyes settling on Carlos, who looked at Antonio and then looked away. "Calm down, hombre," Carlos said, opening his arms wide, a nervous jiggle beginning in his throat. "What's gotten into you?" Antonio waved his hand and sat down. A diesel truck rattled down 8th Street, headed for downtown. "My daughter is a district attorney in Los Angeles," Maximo said after the noise of the truck died. "December is one of the busiest months." He felt a heat behind his eyes he had not felt in many years. "Feel one in your hand," Antonio said. "Feel how heavy that is." When the children were small, Maximo and Rosa used to spend Noche Buena with his cousins in Cardenas. It was a 5-hour drive from Havana in the cars of those days. They would rise early on the 23rd and arrive by mid-afternoon, so Maximo could help the men kill the pig for the feast the following night. Maximo and the other men held the screaming animal down, its wiry brown coat cutting into their gloveless hands. But God, they were intelligent creatures. No sooner did it spot the knife than the animal bolted out of their arms, screaming like Armageddon. It had become the subtext to the Noche Buena tradition. This chasing of the terrified pig through the yard, dodging orange trees and rotting fruit underneath. The children were never allowed to watch. Rosa made sure. They sat indoors with the woman and stirred the black beans. With loud laughter, they shut out the shouts of the men and the hysterical pleadings of the animal as it was dragged back to its slaughter. Juanito, the little dog, gets off the boat from Cuba and decides to take a little stroll down Brickell Avenue. Let me make sure I understand the joke. Juanito is a dog. Whoa, whoa, that's pretty good. Yes, Juanito is a dog, goddammit. Raul looked up, startled. Maximo shuffled the pieces hard and swallowed. He swung his arms across the table in wide, violent arcs. One of the pieces flew off the table. Hey, hey, watch it with that. What's wrong with you? Maximo stopped. He felt his heart beating. I'm sorry, he said. He went over the edge of the table to see where the pieces had landed. Wait a minute. He held the table with one hand and tried to stretch up for the piece. What are you doing? Just wait a minute. When he couldn't reach, he stood, pulled the piece toward him with his foot, sat back down, and reached for it. Again, this time grasping it between his fingers and his palm. He put it face down on the table with the other and shuffled, slowly, his mind barely registering the traffic. Where was I? Juanito the little dog. Right. Bow wow. Maximo took a deep breath. He's just off the boat from Cuba and it's strolling down Brickell Avenue. He's looking up at the tall and shiny buildings. Coño, he says, dazzled by all the mirrors. There's nothing like this in Cuba. Hey, hey, professor, we have tall buildings. Jesus Christ, Maximo said. He pressed his thumb and forefinger into the corners of his eyes. This is after Castro. Then, let me just get out for Christ's sake. He stopped shuffling. Raoul looked away. Ready now? Juanito, the little dog, is looking up at all the tall buildings, and he's so happy to finally be in America because all his cousins have been telling him what a great country it is, right? You know, they were sending back photos of their new cars and girlfriends. A joke about dogs who drive cars. I've heard it all. Hey, they are Cuban super dogs. All right. They are sending back photos of their new owners or the biggest bones any dog has ever seen. Anything you like. Use your imaginations. Maximo stopped shuffling. Where was I? You were at the part where Juanito buys a Rolls Royce. The man laughed. Okay, Antonio, why don't you three fools continue the joke? Maximo got up from the table. You made me forget the rest of it. Oh, come on, Chico, sit down. Don't be so sensitive. Published in 2001. Ana Menendez, all right reserves, ISBN 0-8021-1688-4. Can find the original in the comments.